Adam Bandt, amongst the drama of the three independents choosing government, I think one of the stories that was missed or glossed over in the weeks subsequent to the election was the rise of the Greens to become the third major political force in Australia. As a new arrival in Canberra, have you felt welcome in the halls of power?
Yeah, I have. I mean, it was a pretty interesting first few weeks on the job. One of the things that did impress me, I guess, from a basic human interaction point of view, was how much goodwill was shown in those first few weeks. I mean, I never met these independents before. I hadn't met Julia Gillard before. I ended up having phone conversations with Tony Abbott, and there was enormous goodwill during that period to, I guess, address the situation that we were in. So it certainly felt welcome. And I was in a pretty fortunate situation of having Christine Milne and Bob Brown, who'd both been in balance of power situations before. And so we had an enormous resource to draw on, so I was pretty lucky in that respect.
There was a lot of talk of the Greens vote being a protest vote, that it was a vote against the major parties. Did you view it as a protest vote, or do you think this sentiment accounts for a large part of your support?
Not really. I mean, we were pretty clear in my seat, in my campaign, that disillusionment with the major parties was only going to get us so far. What that was going to get was, in the same way that with Lindsay Tanner's retirement, it didn't mean anything automatic for us. It meant that people were perhaps going to take their first serious look at us, and we were very clear that in order to convince people to vote for us, we needed a positive program. And so we structured a campaign, certainly in Melbourne, based around some core values of compassion and sustainability and equality, but also trying to be very clear about saying we need to start offering, I guess, a concrete program about what we would do if we were in power. And it's that we tried to use to win people over. And you mentioned before about the rise of the Greens. I mean, and I think it did get a bit glossed over in the aftermath of the election. I mean, the biggest swing in this election wasn't to the coalition, it was to the Greens. It was almost double the swing. Our vote went up by 50%, and around the country now, in the lower house, I mean, we've got about more than 1 in 9 people voting Greens around the country now. That, if you had proportional representation, that would mean we'd had 17 out of 150 seats in the lower house. We don't, we've got 1. But the biggest swing was over about 3.5%, I think, to us, compared with a swing to the coalition of under 2%. And I think that's something worth reflecting on.
There was also an element of optimism in the vote for the Greens. It was a vote for a party that tried to present an optimistic program and tried to broaden the political discourse. Are you worried about how voters will respond when you become part of the government that passes legislation that is essentially a product of compromise?
Yes and no. I mean, what we're seeing in Tasmania, for example, where we've now got ministers, in ACT, where they've been in partnership, I guess, with Labor, but not in coalition government, but they have supported Labor without taking positions in the executive, is the beginning, I guess, of us having to now enact our what we believe in, and to demonstrate that it is enactable. And the thing about the government that we've got at the moment federally is that no one's got a majority. So no one, neither Labor nor us, essentially is in a position to say, well, here's what we believe in, and so we want to deliver 100% of it. And so it's going to, of necessity, require collaboration, and maybe someone will get everything they want in one respect, but I think that's not going to be the case across the board. So I am optimistic about the prospects of this government, but I'm also realistic that we're not going to be able to get everything that we want, absolutely.
On the issue of the NBN, the National Broadband Network, which was such an important part of the support, the government's support in the end in winning the independence, will you support the coalition's call for the full costing of the broadband network?
I mean, I think costing is important, and I think before legislation comes up and is approved, I think that's going to, of necessity, have to happen. But I do think the NBN is important, and I mean, we've made that clear from the start that we support that as well. And in fact, it's going to be necessary. Our support's going to be necessary in the Senate to pass that. Yes, costing is important, but I think it's a much better proposal than I think the Coalition's is a really quickly cobbled together proposal that isn't really going to deliver.
Do you think, generally speaking, on the issue of costings, that all policies should be costed as a matter of course if they're to be implemented?
We tried before the election to get our policies costed. We submitted them to Treasury, and Treasury said, no, we only cost opposition policies. One of the things that we've built into the agreement that we struck with the government is the capacity for us as Greens to submit our policies for costing. And that's going to be pretty important because the effect of the agreement that's been reached is we'll support the government on questions of no confidence and on questions of supply. But on all other issues, we're going to need, the government is going to need to find enough support either from the Coalition or from amongst the crossbenchers in order to get something passed. Now, that means so budget time or anything like that, for example. I mean, they're going to need to sit down and discuss with us quite seriously every measure that they want to pass. So everything apart from supply is going to be the subject of discussion and negotiation. And so it's incumbent on us, I think, if we want something done, to be able to say, well, here's a costed policy for us, here's what we're going to do. Now, for things that don't have such significant financial impacts, of course, not everything needs to be costed, or at the least, the cost implications aren't same-sex marriage, for example. You know, maybe there's cost implications for that, but that shouldn't be the decisive factor.
Bob Brown raised the prospect that private members' bills could be presented by the Greens, for example, if they have the support of the coalition parties. Would you consider introducing private members' bills that have budgetary impacts, as in major impacts on the bottom line?
Yeah, we've as part of the agreement that we reached, and again that the independents reached, that we will have the ability for the first time to have private members' bills or dedicated time for legislation from the crossbenchers, from the Greens, and from the opposition to be introduced, debated and voted on. And that having it voted on is a key thing. Previously, the bills would languish down the bottom of the notice paper. So we're going to be able to force those things to a vote. We've made it clear that as far as the general budget and appropriations is concerned, that's particularly if something is going to result in a new tax or an impost, that's primarily within the gift of the government. And so we're not going to try and legislate new taxes. But there are things that we want to see delivered that will have financial consequences. And that's yes, it's up to us to have them properly costed and so on before that comes up. But we are a party that's got our own legislative program, and I wouldn't rule out at all the moving of legislation that's going to have financial impacts.
On another issue regarding private members' bills, euthanasia, it was noted in the media by some letter writers that euthanasia didn't appear on, for example, your campaign literature when you, in the run-up to the election, but that it was the first thing that the Greens introduced or announced that they would try to introduce. Could you make a comment on euthanasia as part of your overall and how it related to your campaign strategy?
The general point, though, I don't think that's a fair analysis of what's happened. I mean, before the results were declared, we spent 3 weeks in Canberra and we helped negotiate the formation of government. And as part of that, I mean, what I said during my campaign was that my number one priority was tackling climate change. And within a couple of weeks of the election, we negotiated an agreement with the government that had as its a key element of it the establishment of a committee that's going to look at putting a price on pollution, price on carbon. And I think that, I'll come back to the euthanasia point, but that I think it's really important to focus on that, because if you look at the last election, at the last government rather, I think Labor tried to play politics with climate change, and they negotiated with the coalition, and they effectively tried to use it to wedge the coalition, and you might say it's a successful tactic from that narrow perspective. Of course, we then saw a change in leadership. But they didn't talk to us at all. They weren't interested in negotiating climate change policy with the Greens. It was an issue that they negotiated with the Liberals, the Party of Climate Change deniers, and then presented it to us as a fait accompli and said, oh, well, we can't get them now. That deal we've negotiated with them has fallen over. You better support it. And we said, well, no. So we've managed to press the reset switch on that, we hope. So I think, let's not forget that. That's a pretty big thing. That's number one. Euthanasia, what Bob Brown has said is that if private members' bills time is available to him, what's going to be at the top of his list is a bill that gives the Northern Territory the right to, gives them back the right to debate and pass legislation with respect to euthanasia. So that's the parameters of the bill. So it won't be a bill to have it roll out across the country. It's to give the Northern Territory the rights that the states have. The Greens as a party in WA and South Australia have got legislation coming up within the next month. And as we've moved here in Victoria as well, dying with dignity legislation. So it's a matter that's important to us. So I think, yes, it'll be Bob's first bill, private members' bill, but I don't think it's fair to say it's the Greens' number one priority.
You're often accused of being a party that's for more taxation, and that the party has a legislative program that would be very difficult to implement without introducing more taxation. In some ways, I think the major parties have been terrified by the idea of introducing, now, in particular now, carbon tax is the great new tax. The mining tax is seen as something that really damaged the government. Do you think the major parties have failed the Australian public by having a realistic discussion about how you cost government services?
Well, I mean, for the last 30 years, I mean, the major parties have agreed fundamentally on neoliberalism, essentially. And so there's certain economic and social policy settings that have had bipartisan support and have been almost unchallengeable. And core to that is a shift towards user pays models of almost everything, of turning citizen subjects into consumers, and there's been, and that's gone side by side with, I guess, a slow death of political imagination, you might say, and there's real sense that we can't think big anymore. And the financial crisis kind of was an interesting spanner in the works for all of that, because all of a sudden, all these ideas that were supposedly anathema, like government intervention, all of a sudden came back up. If there's a silver lining to any of that, it's that it's perhaps put back on the table some of these questions in the political imagination that have previously been erased. So all of a sudden it is possible again to think about government intervening to build large-scale infrastructure, or and it's possible to start saying, well, actually the market fails, and when the market fails it has consequences, so what are we going to do about it? Now, and then along comes the mining tax, and I think, I mean, for me it was almost the sleeper issue in terms of things that people volunteered to me during the course of the campaign. Yes, there's climate change, yes, there was asylum seekers, but the one thing that surprised me the most, that people came up to me and volunteered, was that they couldn't understand why the government backed down on the mining tax. They thought it was a good idea. They thought you only get to dig these things up and sell them once, and so we should get a proper return, because once they're gone, they're gone. And I think there's a real, perhaps the conventional analysis will be that the government shouldn't have tried to introduce the tax and it cost it seats in Western Australia or in Queensland. But I think there's an perhaps equally strong undercurrent of people saying, well, you should have stuck to your guns. What a good way to fund Australia's future. And I mean, we actually want the mining tax to be higher than it was, and we want that money to be specifically set aside for or used to fund a sovereign infrastructure fund, as they have in other countries.
On that issue, there's no guarantee that that the mining tax will go through, even as it's talked about at the moment, the most recent iteration of it. If it's further softened, would you still support it?
Oh, I think that's tough to know without seeing the details. I mean, they haven't even yet released the details of the supposed agreement that's been reached with the mining companies. I think we've made it clear that we're not going to block it, but you'd obviously hope it maintains some integrity with what it initially was and doesn't morph into something else.
There was something really interesting I found happened in the recent election, particularly in the aftermath, with all the discussions with the rural regional independents and the Greens appearing. That one of the key moments of the post-election period in my memory is when you were sitting next to Bob Katter, and I think you said, I never thought I'd find myself to the right of Bob Katter, which was a very funny line at the time. But there was also a strange truth underlying that it became evident after the election that there was so many similarities between the programs of those representing rural and regional Australia and the Greens program.
Yeah. I've just done the interesting exercise of reading the inaugural speeches of each of those independents, and it's a tale of the human consequences of neoliberalism, and there's a real sense that yes, they talk about it in terms of protections and tariffs and so on, but there's a real sense in which this rush over the last 30 years of both major parties around a common economic and social program has left many people behind and has resulted in enormous dislocation. And whilst these things are being expressed in different ways and playing out differently in some ways in regional Australia to the cities, I think there's enormous commonalities, and so I think it's going to be an interesting over the next 3 years to see if and how those commonalities find their way into political discourse. And it's something I'm glad you brought it up, because it's that's the other story about this election, is a real move away from what we've been told there's no alternative to for the last few decades.
There's an interesting something that an alliance that formerly we thought perhaps was stronger than it seems to be now. The Wild Rivers legislation in Queensland has raised divisions between Greens and some Indigenous leaders, in particular Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton, and I think everyone recognises that Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton don't speak for all Indigenous Australians. But is your argument in relation to the Wild Rivers legislation that no one should exploit the land? And if so, isn't it a bit late when all the other land around them has been exploited? So perhaps it's a bit inconsistent to apply a kind of logic now when it's never been applied before? Well,
I don't think so. I mean, I think that you made the correct point that there's different views on this within Indigenous Australia, and I don't see the coalition rushing to say that we need to have self-determination brought back up to the top of the political agenda. And you watch even in the first sitting of Parliament, I mean, there's legislation to introduce a waste dump to put a waste dump on lands that the traditional owners do not want in Northern Territory, Central Northern Territory, Muckaty Station. They don't want that there. All of a sudden, those questions of self-determination aren't that relevant there. There's a broader political discussion that's going on in which that people like Noel Pearson are part of from a certain perspective. And I don't I don't accept that. Yes, it's complex, but I don't think that one can simply say that we're being hypocritical. I mean, we're talking about preservation of some pretty amazing natural environment, and I think that's completely justified to defend that.
I just want to move on to a couple of, I guess, fairly tricky issues that have come up also since the election. There was an editorial in the Australian newspaper where they stated that they thought that the Greens should be destroyed at the box office. At the box office. I used to work at the Melbourne Film Festival. The Australian declared that they believe the Greens should be destroyed at the ballot box, and the implication being that they would do all they can to see that this happens. Do you think this is an acceptable position for a newspaper to take?
No. The Australian is a phenomenal campaigning organisation, and it has been unashamed in that, and I have no doubt that they will do what they can to try and bring down this government and to try and make this government fail. And
do you intend to respond in any way?
Well, look, I mean, they're enormously powerful, and they have significant resources, but they are what they are. And I think, personally, there used to be a time where I really enjoyed reading the Weekend Australian, probably a good decade ago, but I certainly felt that there was a variety of views presented there. I didn't feel like it was a partisan newspaper, whereas now I think it is. For example, I had a nuanced discussion with them about our legislative timetable and what might happen now with respect to same-sex marriage, and would it be introduced in the first sitting or would it come later? And we wake up to a newspaper that's got the headline, "Greens to rush same-sex marriage." And actually, when you read the article, that's not what is said at all. That was clearly, that came out on the weekend that the independents went back to their electorate to decide which party they were going to support. Clearly, this is a newspaper that is intervening on the side of the coalition. That's what it is, and I think if you read it through that lens, then one understands that.
Do you think it'll make a difference that this is being discussed so openly now? As in, there was a Laura Tingle article about 2 weeks ago where she raised it as a public issue. She belled the cat, if you like. Do you think it'll make a difference to how the Australian approaches
I don't know, but
politics?
I'm glad that people are talking about it. I think it's been an unspoken truth for a while, and I think people have accepted it, but I'm glad that it's being discussed publicly. To be fair to them, they made the point, I think in yesterday's paper or the day before, that at the 2007 election they supported Rudd, called for a vote for Rudd, and that's right. But perhaps they could see the writing on the wall at that point. But I think on the whole, when you look at them, I think it's undeniable the position that they take if you step back and do a proper analysis of where they've been over the last few years.
Robert Mann, on the issue of boat people, recently said that he thought that the left had failed on this issue because they refused to acknowledge that Howard's policies did actually stop the boats. How do you respond to this representation?
Well, I don't think that if the left has failed, I don't know that that's why. It's really about what values underpin the decisions that we make about how to respond to the situation of people movement and why it is that people are moving and so on. And it was, if there's been any failure, it's that it's become a debate around integrity of borders and border security, whereas in fact, and so hence, stopping the boats becomes something that one can judge the success or failure of, and therefore that's a good or a bad thing. That's the frame that it's still in, sadly. I think it's still in. And one bright light, I think, is that, you know, in terms of my election, like we put it up there squarely as an issue and said that there should be that compassion should be elevated as a means for dealing. So I think that's the debate that we've got to have, not about whether we accept success or otherwise of stopping the boat.
But in some respects, as a political issue, the horse has bolted, because that is the frame now, that we're always worried about how many boat people have arrived. Yeah. So I think the major parties will always respond in a way when the numbers grow, as they're growing at the moment. I think they will always come to a political solution that reduces the number of boats, unless somehow the debate's redefined.
Well, I think that's critical, because, I mean, it's not my job to be a political commentator and advisor for Labor, but I don't see how that's a debate that they can ever win. If we are going to continually have some kind of internal civil war in Australia around those ideas, then yes, it's going to push us further to the right. But I don't accept the permanence of this current arrangement. I mean, in the years after the Vietnam War, Australia nationally took in close to 100,000 refugees and their families on what was essentially a bipartisan agreement about settlement program. Now, it really only was with, there's an introduction to mandatory detention by Labor in the 80s, I think, when we started to begin to see a shift. But I don't. This problem is only going to get worse. I mean, with the effects of climate change, you are going to see a growing amount of instability and a growing number of people who want to move from areas that are now no longer agriculturally sustainable. You're going to see island populations starting to disappear underwater. Like the numbers are going to grow, the problem's going to exacerbate rather than reduce, and so we need a frame about how we're going to discuss it. And I do think that if you look at what the Labor Party is doing, I think they are scrambling around at the moment to try and find a potential new frame for it.
But I think implicit in the position that the Greens are taking is that you'll have to accept that there are more boat arrivals as a result of a softer policy on immigration. Well,
I don't know that that's necessarily right. I mean, I think that there's ways of it's acceptable to have a debate about what the appropriate number is of people that should be received and how they should be received and what particular categories that we're going to receive. And I think that once we, if you want to talk about messages that get sent out to the rest of the world, etc., if it's known that this is the number in Australia and this is how you get in and out, then to the extent that pull factors are relevant in all of this, and I've got to say I'm not convinced that more boats are coming simply because we've changed our internal policy. There's a stack of other reasons, the push factors that are forcing people into that situation. I don't accept the proposition that automatically more boats are going to come just because you have a more humane and more compassionate approach.
Okay. Just two more quick questions. Do you think the ALP, as a result of the rise of the Greens recently, will move to the left to try to regain the positions and the voters that they lost? Or do you think that they're more likely to outsource the left-ish policies to the Green Party so that they can concentrate more on the centre and the centre-right?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I mean, it's I'm not a commentator on what the ALP will or won't do. The reason for our growth, and I think you alluded to it before, is that I think we are no longer, we're in a transition, I think, that as the Greens, we're not simply a protest party. It's not vote for us because you're dissatisfied with something else, or vote for us to send a message to Labor or Liberal. What we are increasingly getting better at communicating is a optimistic political program based around some pretty important values. Now, I understand that poses a challenge to the Labor Party, because if you ask the question now, what does the Labor Party stand for? I don't think many people could answer it. But if you ask the question, what do the Greens stand for, you know. And so we're just going to keep articulating what we stand for, and we're now in the process of, as we get more representation, more resources that come with that, we're in a position to put more flesh on the bones about that. And but interestingly, in it all, the four key founding principles of the Greens, the pillars, are grassroots democracy, social justice, environmental sustainability, peace and non-violence. Now, they in effect haven't altered. The times have changed, and so the program changes, but they haven't changed. Whereas I don't think you could point to whatever the Labor Party was founded on 100 plus years ago and suggest that those core principles are still the same. They'll have their own debate about what they stand for. I don't know how they're going to respond to ours, but people seem to like what we're saying.
Slavoj Žižek, who is a cultural theorist who I understand you're familiar with, he once said, "Don't just do something, talk." What do you think besides climate change? What do we need to talk more about?
Political imagination. And Žižek also said, when looking at the ideology of climate change in about the mid-90s, he said, why is it easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism? Now, you don't need to be a Marxist like he is to understand the import of what he's saying. He's saying that the way of doing business as usual has become the new real, and it's impossible to think outside it. And I do think that I think we need to talk about everything, and we need to begin a dialogue about everything. And I think the interesting thing about the conjuncture that we're in at the moment, I know you said apart from climate change, what do we need to talk about? But climate change kind of at the moment overdetermines everything, I think. And we're in this period where the scientists are saying, look, we've got a decade to really sort this out, or we start running a risk of unacceptable climate change and runaway climate change. That's a lot of work to do in a decade. And in the humanities, I mean, so scientists have said what they've said, and it's kind of over to the humanities now to help us find a way out of this. We've kind of tended to presume in the humanities that we have infinite time to debate the perfect society, the good life. We probably don't at the moment. And so we need, in a short period of time, in a sense, to rapidly all engage in a conversation and become experts about a whole variety of things. And that's around the organisation of the economy, around organisation of society, how our own lives, individual lives, are going to be more sustainable, how our good life relates to the broader social good life. And I think that's pretty exciting. Like, it's terrifying, but it's exciting that there's this conjuncture where we can all now engage in a discussion about what kind of world we want, and that's politics. And so it's pretty... climate change can be an entree into now reopening political imagination, and that's for me the exciting part about what's happening at the moment.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.